It is 4 in the morning at a freight depot outside St. Louis in 1986. A Peterbilt 359 pulls out, and when the driver hits the throttle, windows rattle 3 blocks away. Under that hood is a Detroit 8V92TA, a V8 two-stroke screaming through twin chrome stacks, leaving a haze of blue-black smoke that hangs in the air long after the truck is gone. That engine is the most powerful diesel on the American highway, lighter than its rivals, faster revving than anything else hauling freight, and in less than 10 years it will be gone. Not retired, not optional, gone. So why does an engine still being requested by the US military, still hauling the M1 Abrams across America, get pulled off the production line? Most people will tell you emissions. That is the easy answer, the clean answer. But the real story involves a 1938 engineering decision, a roots blower, and a federal regulation. And it did not ban this engine, and it just named the disease that had been killing it for 60 years. And the strangest part, you have heard this engine, smelled it, ridden behind it. The school bus, the fire truck that came to your house. By the end of this, you will know exactly why the 8V92 had to die, and where every retired one of them is still working. But let's start with what almost everyone gets wrong. Yes, the 8V92 was killed by emissions. Most people stop there and feel like they understand. Let me show you what that actually meant, because the regulation never names the engine. The regulation names a number. In 1990, Congress passed the Clean Air Act amendments. The new rules demanded that urban transit buses cut diesel particulate emissions by 92% by 1996. Every other heavy-duty diesel had to achieve an 83% reduction in the same window. NOx had to drop 33% by 1998, with a hard ceiling of 4.0 grams per brake horsepower hour. These were not gentle suggestions. They were standards engineered around what the cleanest 4-stroke diesels could already deliver. The 2-strokes were not in the room when those numbers were written. But here is what almost no one mentions. The EPA did not ban the 8V92. The EPA wrote a number, and Detroit Diesel's engineers could not reach it. Industry reports describe millions of dollars poured into trying. New injector geometries, recalibrated timing, aftercoolers, modified ports. None of it closed the gap. By summer 1995, the entire 92 series was pulled from the on-highway market. By July 1998, Detroit Diesel chairman Roger Penske announced Power Evolution, a formal program retiring every 2-stroke line the company had ever built. The Series 53, the Series 71, the Series 92, the Series 149, 4 generations, 1 announcement, gone. Every competing engine on the market was a 4-stroke. The 8V92 was not, and that single difference, a difference in how the engine breathed air, meant no software patch, no fuel system upgrade, no catalytic add-on could close the gap. Not because the engineers were not trying, but because the design itself was wrong for the new century. The emissions story is the symptom. The disease was a decision made in 1938. The 8V92 could not meet the new standards because dirty exhaust was not a bug. It was a side effect of how the engine breathed. The same thing that made the 8V92 the most powerful diesel on the highway is the same thing that made it impossible to clean up. A normal diesel fires once every 2 revolutions. The 8V92 fires every single revolution, twice as many power strokes per minute. That is why a 12.1-liter Detroit could outpull a 14-liter Cummins. The pistons are never resting. But a 2-stroke diesel cannot draw its own air. So Detroit bolted a gear-driven roots blower, a mechanical air pump, to the side of every 2-stroke they built. It forces air through ports cut directly into the cylinder walls, pushing spent exhaust out the valves on top. Engineers called it uniflow scavenging. Truckers called it the scream. Here's where the problem begins. To push air through those ports, the cylinder walls have to stay oiled to keep the rings sealed. And the oil that lubricates those rings sits exactly where the fresh air is rushing in. Every time the piston travels down, a small amount of lubricating oil gets pulled into the combustion chamber, and then it burns with the fuel. Every single revolution. Old truckers have a word for this. They call it slobbering. Oil literally pours out of the exhaust stack at idle. Operators reported burning a gallon of oil per day on top of fuel. The engine was not leaking. It was working as designed. And here's the part that connects to your actual life. The blue-tinged smoke at a construction site. The grease ring on an old Greyhound stack. The black puff when a fire truck pulls out cold. That is not an old truck failing. That is a Detroit two-stroke doing exactly what it was built to do. When the EPA started measuring particulate matter, the four-strokes had a path to compliance. The 8V92 did not. But here is what makes it tragic. The two-stroke design was not a mistake. It was the best engineering answer to a completely different problem. And for 60 years, it was right. The 8V92's emissions problem was hard-coded by a decision made before the Second World War. Detroit Diesel was founded as a General Motors division in January 1938, and its first engine, the inline 6-71, used the same two-stroke roots blower architecture the 8V92 would inherit 4 decades later. Behind it was Charles Kettering, General Motors research chief, the man who had invented the electric starter. Kettering's team chose two-stroke because it gave more power per pound, per cubic inch, per dollar than anything else. Lighter blocks, fewer moving parts, easier to cast in wartime factories. In World War II, the 6-71 went into the M4A2 Sherman tank. American factories built hundreds of thousands of these engines because they could be cast quickly, rebuilt in field depots, and run on lower-grade diesel. The same architecture that helped win the Battle of the Bulge powered the Peterbilt rattling your windows in 1986. 60 years, one basic design. By the 1970s, the 71 series had grown into the 92 series. Bigger bore, same roots blower, same scream. The 8V92, turbocharged and aftercooled and nicknamed the Silver, produced 445 horsepower from 12.1 liters, more than the V12 12V71 it replaced, in a smaller, lighter package. Truckers called it the Screaming Jimmy, the Hemi Charger of diesel. Then, in 1987, Detroit Diesel itself introduced something completely different. The Series 60, inline 6, 4-stroke, the first production heavy-duty engine in the world with integrated electronic controls. Cleaner, more fuel efficient, no roots blower, no oil bleeding into the combustion chamber. In January 1988, Roger Penske bought 60% of Detroit Diesel. By 1993, on-highway market share grew from 3% to 33%, almost entirely on the back of the Series 60. The 8V92 was being killed by its own manufacturer years before the Clean Air Act forced anyone's hand. The 8V92 wasn't taken out by a single villain. It was outrun by physics, outsold by its own 4-stroke sibling, and formalized into retirement by federal regulation. But the engine didn't disappear. It just went somewhere most people never look. So where did all the 8V92s actually go? Detroit Diesel built millions of them between 1974 and 1995, and the vast majority did not get scrapped. They were reassigned. And here's where you realize the engine is still in your life right now. Start with the military, because the military does not care about civilian emissions law. The U.S. Army's HEMTT, the 8x8 truck that carries fuel and ammunition to combat units, runs the 8V92TA. The Marine Corps LVS uses the same engine. The M1070, the 10x10 truck that physically hauls the M1 Abrams across America, runs the 8V92TA. The Cadillac Gage Stingray light tank uses the 8V92TA, producing 550 horsepower. The Israeli Aksarit Mark II uses the 8V92TA at 850 horsepower. Each one remains in active service. Now the bus you rode. Prevost and MCI motor coaches built from 1980 through 1995, the same coaches Greyhound used cross-country, the same buses charter companies used for high school trips, the same Bluebird motorhomes converted into recreational vehicles, almost all ran 6 V92 or 8 V92 power. Thousands are still on American highways. Tugboats in every American harbor. Commercial fishing boats from Alaska to the Gulf. Yachts. Workboats. Marine industry reports cite million-mile service lives between major overhauls. Million-mile service lives are common in the records. Fire trucks. American fire apparatus built before 1995, the pumpers in your hometown, overwhelmingly ran on the 8V92. Some are still in reserve service. The smell at the airport when you walked past the fuel truck. The shudder when a Greyhound pulled in. The roar at a 4th of July parade when the old engine company drove by. You have stood next to this engine, breathed its exhaust, ridden behind it, without knowing the design was older than your parents. So here is where you actually land. You came into this thinking the 8V92 was banned because it was dirty. You are not wrong, but that is a third of the answer. The 8V92 was killed by emissions only because its emissions problem was hard-coded into a 1938 design choice. Fire every revolution, force air with a roots blower. Except that oil will burn alongside fuel, and that single choice was correct for 60 years. Correct in Sherman tanks crossing North Africa. Correct in the muscle car era of American freight. And it stopped being correct the day the Clean Air Act of 1990 turned particulate matter into a federal number. That 4 a.m. Peterbilt rolling out of the depot was not just loud. You were hearing the last decade of a 60-year-old American engineering bet, power per pound over parts per million. You are not just looking at an old diesel engine. You are looking at the moment American emissions law caught up with American engineering, and the engine that lost the fight while still winning every military contract that did not read its exhaust report. And if you think the 8V92's ending was strange, wait until we get into the engine Detroit built to replace it, because the Series 60 story ends in a federal courtroom, an $83 million fine, and the first time a major American diesel manufacturer was caught using what the EPA called a defeat device.